So let me just tell you a little bit more about what we've got planned for you this evening. Now, as publishing science is the core of our knowledge. It's what we base our clinical practice on. And for those of us who are working in clinical academia or interested in research, the best way to get your message out and get your science out, without doubt, is through peer-reviewed journals. But sometimes it can seem rather daunting to turn your work into a paper that can get accepted, peer-reviewed, and published. And we understand that. We've all been through it. Everyone who is an editor at RBMO has all had to start out on that journey, and we know how daunting it can be and difficult it can seem. But there are pointers which I think we can give you this evening, ranging from just how to approach writing a paper, and I'll be talking to you about that first, then to something much more topical in a way, which is AI. AI is everywhere, isn't it now? And is certainly coming into writing papers and publishing. And there's been a lot of debate over the last 2 or 3 years as to what the role of AI should be, ChatGPT. And I think it's probably fair to summarize it as saying that there are risks and benefits associated with it. And I'm delighted to say that we have an expert speaker who'll be following on from me called Gareth Dyke, who's going to be talking to us about how we can maybe use AI in an appropriate way to help the writing process, as well as perhaps the editing one. Following on from that, once you've hopefully written your paper and perhaps have used AI and declared it appropriately in writing your paper, the next process is to submit it to the journal for consideration. And Duncan Nicholas, who is our development editor, will be talking you through what happens once the paper comes to the journal and the processes that take place, what the chances are of acceptance at the different stages, and how that whole process is managed. And I hope you'll find that very helpful. And then our fourth talk this evening is what happens after the paper is accepted. Now, it's fair to say that many of us, when we receive the news that the paper has been accepted, we think, great, that's it. It's off my desk now. I just wait to see it appear on PubMed and celebrate. And that's fair enough. I do understand that. However, what we have learned at RBMO is that quite often, even though the peer review process is very careful and rigorous, that sometimes little errors, unintentional in the vast majority of cases, will slip through that process. And at RBMO, we've taken a position to invest heavily in that post-acceptance editing process. And the aim of that is to make good papers better. And Fiona Warrander will be talking to us about that process, what they're looking for, what they're doing, and maybe how you can ensure that your paper requires as little scientific editing as possible. So that's what we've got in store for you. We've got until another 2 hours, which we will take if necessary. If we finish earlier, then that's fine. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the 4 talks, one after the other, because I think they flow through very, very carefully together, very well together. And then we'll have a Q&A session. So do send in your Q&A, your questions, and please use the Q&A button, not the chat, because the Q&A button is where the questions will be received. They will be put onto a screen in front of me, and then I will select questions from that list for all of our speakers and hopefully be able to get your question answered. So that is how we're going to be doing this evening. And before I open my talk, I think it's probably worth saying just a couple of things about the journal. It is, those of you who connect with the journal quite a bit online will know this has been a very special year for us at RBMO. It's our 25th year since Sir Robert Edwards founded the journal, Nobel Prize winner, of course, for IVF. And we're very proud to continue the tradition of what he wanted, which was a journal that publishes innovative science, kind of upstream science, new ideas, but does it in a way that encourages and helps the authors to produce their best work. And that is one tradition that we've kept through our scientific editing, which we'll be hearing more about later. So I think we'll get going with the first talk. I'll share my screen and hopefully we can, you'll be able to see this okay. So here we are. Quite a title for a talk to do in 20 minutes or so. how to write a good paper. Many of you who've been at university and have been on courses and done PhDs will have had quite a lot of education on this. So I'm aware that many of you are already experts in this. But I think it's probably it's worthwhile just to be reminded of the key things that journals are looking for when you submit your paper, just to be reminded of that, and what the readers are looking for as well. And in doing so, I'm going to make a very heavy call on a former colleague and one of my mentors in my career, and that for many people is Professor Hans Evers. Now, many of you will know Hans Evers, former chair of ESHRE, who was very well known as a clinical scientist and also as a teacher in how to write papers. And much of what I'm going to tell you, I'm afraid, is unashamedly influenced and taken from what he taught us 20, 30 years ago, because I still think that it hangs together very beautifully as an approach to writing a paper. So Hans, thank you very much for that. And of course, also I'd like to acknowledge my co-chief editor, Juan Garcia Velasco, who also helped put this talk together that I'm going to give you now. So let me start by reminding you a little bit about the journal. Juan and I wrote this editorial earlier this year to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the journal. And I think in order to put what we're going to be talking about tonight into some context, it's worth just reminding a little bit about us as a journal and why we feel we're a little bit different from others. It's fair to say that our dedication is to showcasing pioneering research. So we tend to be looking for papers which are presenting new ideas, new concepts, but in a very rigorous way, in the right way. Not all our papers need to be randomized controlled trials, but they need to be convincing in the way they're written and reasonable in the conclusions that they're drawn, because that way they can maybe set and open a new pathway for research which others can then develop. So it is a platform for new ideas. And one other thing that I think distinguishes RBMO is our personal approach. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that we are very lucky in having an office of editorial staff, who many of you know, Caroline Blackwell, these names are legendary in our field, who look after the papers when they come in and help the editors identify reviewers and guide the process. So although we use Editorial Manager, which is an online management system for handling papers, we have real people behind it. And I think that is extremely important for us. We have a broad editorial scope, so we cover everything from basic science related to reproductive medicine. And it's probably worth saying that we're looking for basic science that focuses on the human primarily. There are many other journals that will look at zebrafish and other very important models, but we're looking for those that are already coming into the human for science, right the way through to social aspects of what we do, such as new apps or attitudes to sperm donation, that kind of thing. And that's in our section called Reproduction, Technology and Society. So it is a broad scope. It's a broad platform with which we've divided into a number of different sections, which we think can help organize it. And we're looking to bridge that that gap between research and clinical application. So let me get on with the nuts and bolts. So here is Professor Hans Evers, and I always remember him saying, you know, as an editor himself, what was he looking for in a paper? And this is something we all do. We ask ourselves three questions. Is it new? Is the science you're presenting, is it new? Is it novel? Is it true? Can we believe it? And this is very important, of course. And does it matter? You know, is it addressing a topic that's of importance or current interest, or where there's a gap in the literature? And therefore, I think there are 6 questions I would suggest you think about before you start putting pen to paper when you're writing your paper. So remind yourself, what we want to know is, firstly, why did you study the problem in the first place? And that's going to be the introduction. The material and methods is going to be addressing what did you do and how did you do it? That's very straightforward questions. The results was simply, what did you find? And the discussion is, what do your results mean and how does it relate to previous work in the fields? So these are 6 very simple questions. And I think as long as you structure your paper around answering these, you cannot go far wrong. Now, the question then is, how do you do that in a little bit more detail? So let's think about the introduction in the first instance. And there's no doubt, as a reviewer, those of you who review papers, those of you who edit, first impressions count. The initial impression that the reader gets from the paper is from those opening words in the paper, or indeed the abstract. So do take time to make sure that they are convincing and attractive, that you're going to convince your readers why your work is useful and why they should keep reading after the first sentence. So be brief, to the point. Don't put them off right from the start by using heavy language that's opaque and difficult to follow. And in your introduction, simply summarize what is the problem that you're examining, what are their existing solutions, if there are any, which solution so far has been shown to be the best one, but what's its main limitation? Where do you think that gap is? And therefore, what are you hoping to achieve by your study? Try to be consistent with the nature of the journal. Different journals will have different characters and different approach. I think RBMO 1 is one that hopefully is well known to you and well understood. But it's something just to bear in mind. What about an opening sentence? These are some examples which, again, Hans Evers, I remember him presenting these, and I liked them. And I think they are quite a nice way to think of when you're starting. It depends a little bit on what sort of paper you're writing, but you might want to start by the simple expression of what the purpose of the paper is, and that would be something along the lines of, this paper presents an evidence-based approach to diagnosing PID. Now, in one sentence, you've just nailed what this paper is about, and the reader will hope to think, oh gosh, I'm interested in that, or keep reading. The other approach might be, say, well, let's talk about the scope of the paper. This paper discusses 5 causes of fertilization failure after ICSI. Or if it's adopting more of a commentary type position or a viewpoint, you might want to start with something that's a little bit provocative within reason, something along the lines of calling ART clinicians providers insults our professionalism. Well, that's going to wake up a few people who will want to read. You might want to start with a quotation, something that, such as recently in Human Reproduction, or even better, RBMO, Edwards reported that. So this is something that you could start with as well. Or you might want to have a question, which is the safest way to perform a laparoscopy? Very clear to the point. Or an argument. You may state an argument and then challenge it. The diagnosis of PCOS is not based on ultrasound findings. Is this logical? And off you go. You kind of set the scene now, and you can start addressing the introduction in that way. So what I'm going to do in the next is try and help you write a paper in 18 paragraphs. And this is a notion that, again, Hans taught us all. And I think is a very, very useful approach, partly because it makes it less daunting if you think, gosh, I only need 18 paragraphs to write my paper. It also gives it structure, but also encourages brevity if you're writing a paragraph for each one. So let's go through a paper now using these different stages. So we talked about the introduction, how important it is to grab your reader and to make a cogent case for people to read the science that you're presenting. Now, it is important that there's some relevance and link between your introduction and your opening paragraph and the title of your paper. Quite often we see that there's a disconnect there, where perhaps the paper's been written and someone's thought, well, it would be better to change the title a bit, and then they just don't hang together. So before you submit, make sure that your opening paragraph, where you're sort of introducing the reader to what they're going to be learning over the next few minutes as they read your paper, that it relates strongly enough to the title. You've then got to sort of, in that second paragraph, talk about why. Why are you doing the study? You know, what's been published before? Where's the gap? Provide a context and a motivation why you wanted to do this study, and make that very clear. So that's the second paragraph. And in the third paragraph, the introduction, that's really all it needs. It's three paragraphs. The last sentence should begin, the purpose of this study is to. Okay, so you've drawn the reader through the narrative, through the story, as to why you're doing it, and then you make it very clear in one sentence, what is the purpose of this study? And again, it's surprising how many papers we have where you reach the end of the introduction, you still don't know what the paper's going to be about. So do take that effort, and it just readies the reviewer and the reader for what's going to come next. Then we're into the methods. Let's talk about the methods. Obviously, this is how was the problem studied? And here we need some detail, because as the bottom line says on this slide, ultimately, if you read the methods section of a paper, you should have an idea about how you would go and replicate the study. So that's the level of information we want in the methods. Detailed information, the references that you refer to in there need to be correct. And that, of course, applies to the whole paper, but do check that that is the case. You need to identify the processes that you used, how you recruited, what your inclusion and exclusion criteria were, the equipment that you used, and any materials. And as I said before, you should be able to read a methods section and say, okay, I know how they did this study now, and if I wanted to replicate it, I'd know what I would need to do. So how do we turn that into some paragraphs? So now we're talking about paragraph 4 to paragraph 8 of your paper. So in the first paragraph, we want to talk about the subjects. For those of us who are involved in clinical research, we're using people. We need to tell the reader about the people who participated in the study. What were the inclusion and the exclusion criteria? What was the time period over which they participated? Perhaps what was the clinical context from which they were drawn? Multi-center study or from a single unit. You need to tell us about the consent process that they underwent, and in most cases about the IRB approval, the Institutional Review Board approval. Now, journals are rightly very strict on this, particularly for intervention studies. There are some studies and some countries where IRB approval is not required, some designs, but in general it is. And we want a very clear statement about that, and we want evidence also submitted with the paper to show that that has indeed happened, whether that be the letter that you received from the IRB giving you permission or some other documentation of that. Then it's useful to describe your population in demographic terms, and that can be done very helpfully within the table, what their ages were, the background, the clinical characteristics, etc. Then we're into our second paragraph of material and methods, the procedures. And there you detail the experiment, the drugs, the equipment that were used. If you were using ovarian stimulation, briefly describe it. What I would say is you can assume that your reader knows something about the topic. So when you're describing an IVF cycle, you know, it doesn't need to be right down to sort of the very, very basics of every single, we scanned every 2 or 3 days to monitor follicles. Just tell something about the stimulation protocol you used, and if there's any deviation from standard practice, highlight that. Definitions and criteria are very important. If you've used a ranking system to, for instance, to report embryo quality, give the criteria for that, give a reference for it, and make sure that it's very clear what definitions you've used. Tell us a little bit about how the data was collected. Was it a retrospective study, a prospective study? If it was a randomized controlled trial, how did you allocate? How did you ensure concealment and blinding, etc.? These are all very, very important. And if it is a prospective randomized controlled trial, it should have been registered beforehand. We will be looking for that. Please provide evidence of its registration prior to the study starting. And then we want a chapter on the statistics, and that is the tests that you used and something around about the sample size, the justification of the numbers that you included, and where appropriate, a power calculation. So I think all of this is very standard. Those of you who've written a paper before will be familiar with all of these. And as you can see, you can cover this in 5 paragraphs. Now we get to hopefully the exciting bit of your paper. And here what we want you to do is to tell a clear and easy to understand story. Take the hand of your reader and guide them through it so that there's a narrative there that they can follow very, very logically. You need to focus on the main findings. It's very important within the limited space, but frankly also attention span of the reader, that you focus on the primary findings. What was your main aim and what was the findings of your study? Quite often, as many of you know, when you do a study, you'll stumble upon something else that's rather interesting. That's fine, but make sure that things like that are, at least the findings are put in supplementary materials if the data is secondary. The findings from the study need to be those described in the methods section. That seems a bit of a silly thing to say, but you'd be surprised how many times we will either in the results section or in the discussion section suddenly encounter some data or the conclusion which we're completely unprepared for because there was no mention of this particular analysis at any earlier stage. So make sure when you check your material, your results section, that you've presented data that you said you were going to collect for the reasons that you stated in the introduction. It seems obvious, but quite often that doesn't happen. And that irritates reviewers, and quite rightly so. Highlight findings that differ from findings in previous publications, if you feel that is the case. And then give the results of the statistical analysis. And this is I suppose, the take-home message from this slide. It's a description. The results is just presenting the data. You avoid the temptation to start commenting on it in the results section, how interesting this was or how surprising that was. That's for your discussion section. Interpretation evaluation comes next into the discussion. Now, what about figures and tables? We like figures and tables. We don't like lots of figures and tables. So you need to be very selective about what you present. They can be extremely helpful in presenting results, but please try and remember that what we don't need is to be told the same thing twice, once in the text and again in the tables. Make it very clear in the text what you're referring to and showing in the tables and the data there, but try and avoid too much duplication if you can. And also make sure that if you do duplicate, that you say the same thing, because it's not unusual that we discover that some result is given in the text and we look to the table, actually different data are there. So please do check that before you submit. The captions and legends must be detailed enough to make legends and tables self-explanatory. Somebody reading your paper should be able to look at the table and understand from that what exactly is going on without having to fish through the text to try and understand the table. And as I said, try and avoid unnecessary duplication. So what about our paragraphs then for the results section? So we have 4 here. The first one is demographics, prospective study. So what did you find? Your patients who were randomized to your study, who were they? And we have this classic comparison in the intervention arm, the control arm. Did the randomization work? In general, we believe it will, but it can be helpful to summarize that. In the results section, again, this is where the data is presented. Facts and figures, please. No editorializing or commenting or speculating at this stage. The presentation, as I said, tables and illustrations, we've been through that. And if you have correlations, just make sure that you're very clear about what they are. What was the independent variable? What was the dependent variable? What were the effect size of the variables that you saw? So if you had an outcome that's dependent intervention, how big was that effect size? Make that very clear. Comparison to a gold standard where possible. If we already have a gold standard for perhaps a surgical diagnosis of a condition and you've used a marker, make it very clear how it compares with the gold standard for that diagnosis. And then talk about the statistical significance, the statement of strength of evidence. At this stage, not of the clinical importance. That's for your discussion. Okay, so I hope that is very clear on those 4. So now we've landed in the discussion, and those people who are lazy readers of papers, and let's admit some exist, will often start with the abstract and then go to the discussion. So it's a very important part of your paper for the reader, because there they will learn what the results mean, and that is what this section is about. You're no longer describing the results. Please don't tell us the results again. We've just read them. Tell us what your interpretation of the results are and evaluate what they mean for clinical practice if it's a clinical paper. Ensure that you discuss your results presented and not other results that you haven't presented. Okay, so make sure it's very relevant, it's cogent to the topic that you have or germane to the topic that you've been discussing. And then you'll need to compare your published results with those of others. So how does that convert into our final few paragraphs? So here we see a list of paragraphs there. I'm not going to read these all out for you, but basically you want to start by summarizing the results. Don't introduce new data here. That will really irritate your review and very confusing to the reader too. Talk about the interpretation, try to avoid too many conclusions, because they can dilute the impact of your primary one. You might think, this is wonderful, I'm able to show, look how many conclusions we've got from this study, but it will dilute the impact of that. It's also quite, exhausting for people to process. And you run the risk that in trying to sort of give too much information or draw too many conclusions, you lose the main message. So do bear that in mind. The clinical implications, if it's a clinical study, very important. What does this mean? What are the implications for our management and possibly for basic studies, the pathophysiology? And then we need to reflect very honestly, but briefly, about the limitations of the paper. So be thoughtful and self-critical, discuss the validity of your findings. It's better to be upfront at this stage with any weaknesses that you are aware of the paper. The reviewers tend to be impressed by that, and it generates a good feeling from them towards the paper. When they feel that you're being disingenuous about the design strengths and things like that, that will cause some red flags to fly, which will become harder to rescue later on. So please do think of that. And you can also indeed follow with the strengths of the study as you see. The final one is the so what question. So is it new? Is it true? Does it matter? How does your paper matter? Restate the principal findings and conclusions in one paragraph. Emphasize the clinical or basic science implications of the principal findings, and then finish with indicate the logical next step. Now, most papers that we read will end with the sentence, more studies are required. Yes, but what studies? More studies required is a bit of a cop-out. It sort of covers everything, doesn't it? But you need to be a little bit, it shows both the reader and it gives value to the reader because they know where they should be going next in this. And it tells the reviewer that you've thought about this rather than just saying, well, here's some data, more studies are required. So if I can summarize then, this is my last slide. What we want you to do in the conclusion is to state how the work advances the field from the present state. It's got to be clear, you've got to justify your work in it and suggest future experiments. So here you have 18 paragraphs and how to start and some tips on it. And if you follow these rules and suggestions, as long as your data is sound and valid, you will have presented it in a clear and structured and attractive way. So I hope that is helpful for you. I know there'll be people listening tonight who've written hundreds of papers and are very, very familiar with this, and others who are coming this for the first time and finding it all rather daunting. And I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions about what I've been talking about, we can indeed discuss them later. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our next speaker. So let me tell you a little bit about Gareth Dyke. So Gareth, I haven't met before this evening, to be frank, but I've heard a lot about him from Duncan, and I know he's going to be absolutely brilliant. He is a former academic researcher who now works in publishing, helps researchers around the world understand the academic publishing process, including writing in English, and he's got a lot of expertise on AI and is keeping up to date with it, and it's a field that's moving very, very quickly. And he's going to be telling us a little bit this evening about how we can use AI ethically in research writing. Gareth, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you so much for the introduction. And I loved your talk, Professor Nick. It was fantastic. And those 18 paragraphs for helping researchers understand the structure and what you need to have and what you need to put into an academic paper, I thought was an absolutely fantastic way to get us going, to get us started this evening. So building on that, in this presentation, over the next 15, 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can speed up our use of those 18 paragraphs, how we can build a structure, how we can use AI, which we've all heard about. Of course, we're all using it, I hope, in different aspects of our research and writing and teaching, but how we can use it ethically in our research writing, which really is a hot topic at the moment, as I'm sure you'll be well aware. So researchers, us, you, the people listening to this event this evening, this webinar, will be or could be, maybe they should be, using AI in different aspects of the research cycle. AI for research work And, you know, I'm a little bit of an older type of guy. Like, I remember in the old days when we used to go to the library and search for literature, try to find literature, and do many of the things that we now have a number of tools to help us with in person. So you're going to see a lot of slides in this presentation. There's going to be some text on those slides, but don't worry, we'll give you the PDF. We'll give you all of the content from this presentation. Many of the tools that I'm going to mention briefly, you can go, you can check them out. You can click on the links in this presentation. You can have a go using them for yourself later, for literature searches, for finding gaps, for reading and note-taking, for writing and editing, and even for data synthesis and analysis. We live in a fantastic time because the playing field's being leveled. Everybody now, irrespective of your level of English or your level of ability to write academic papers, has the opportunity to do it much, 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 much more effectively with AI tools. But, of course, as Professor Nick was saying in his talk, ethics matter in all aspects of our research and publishing. And in particular, I would argue that your use of AI tools, ChatGPT and so on, there are very, very many, and we'll touch on many of them in this presentation this evening. But this is critical. Your ethical use of AI is crucial if you are to maintain trust and credibility in your research. And while the use of tools, AI tools, offers us lots of benefits, you've got to ensure accuracy, originality, and transparency in your work. And I'm sure in the Q&A, colleagues in this group will talk about some of the regulations that this particular journal, RBMO, has around the use of AI and AI tools. So what is great, as I mentioned already, I touched on already, is the fact that we are facing a point at the moment where this English gap, this ethics and equity problem around the world is being leveled by the use of AI. And this is fantastic because your use of AI tools can help you. Global researchers are able to now overcome unfair language barriers and bias. But, as I'm going to touch on in this presentation, our use of AI nevertheless must be balanced with both authenticity and accuracy in the way that we use these tools. And with this in mind, just have a look at some of these results. A recent Nature survey: is it okay for AI to be used to write science papers? And you can see, and you can have a look at these slides later, I'm sure we'll share with you the PDF, people's opinions about using AI for tasks like editing and translating. Opinions about using AI to draft those different sections of a research paper. Most people, many people, as you get down into those later sections of the paper that Professor Nick was talking about, the methods, the results, the discussion, we're up 50%, 60% or more of people who are saying that it's never appropriate for AI to be used. So, where do you fit on this spectrum? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later on. Should we be using AI at all? It's really a very interesting time in the world of research, in the world of writing, peer reviewing, and putting papers together. And here you can see the responses from researchers around the use of AI in peer review. 78% of researchers on the graphs down there on the right-hand side of the slide: no, I've never used AI for peer review and I wouldn't consider it. Would you agree with that? Where do you fit? Where do you feel we should be putting AI into our workflows as researchers? Should we be using it or not? Let's get started though. Let's have a quick think about what we can do as researchers with AI tools in our writing. It can help us to brainstorm and idea generate at the start of the writing process. Lots of people use AI as a sketchpad for structuring. I personally think it's great to say, I want to write a paper for RBMO. I'm going to ask one of my favorite AI tools to give me some structure. Give me some ideas about what the shape of that paper should be. But don't forget, you should always avoid sharing sensitive or unpublished information into these tools. But doing things like putting a structure together, building a literature review, fantastic. You can use AI tools to summarize articles, compare perspectives, highlight themes, prompt your favorite tool DeepSeek, ChatGPT. Ask these tools to help you build the structure of your articles, okay? But always, 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 as we'll talk about again in a moment, go back to those original sources, because your scholarly judgment as a researcher cannot be outsourced, and there really is no substitute for actually being on top of your own literature. And as we'll see in a moment, often many of the AI tools that we're aware of in the publishing industry do like to hallucinate, especially when it comes to coming up with citations. I've summarized a number of the different aspects of this for literature searching here on this slide. We won't go through it in detail. You will get this at the end. You will be able to look at this in your own time later. Have a cup of tea, have a look at this. Different ways that we used to do these tasks, both pre and now post AI, for literature searching at the start of that research journey process. Here's a number of the leaders in the market at the moment. Maybe you're using one or other of these. They are all of them very well worth having a look at. If you'd like links or discounts or access to any of these, do get in touch with me at the end of this presentation. You can find me quite easily on LinkedIn. I would be delighted to help you access any of these tools for literature searching, finding, accessing, and building out your access to the literature. Here's a table for you, what they do, questions to ask, the different tools that are out there, the ones that we use. How does it assist me? When should I use it? Do I require the ability to import or export data? Do I need an extension? And how important is cost? Don't worry, once again, I'll keep saying this. You will get access to all of these slides at the end of the presentation. As we search for literature, speeds up the process immeasurably. We then map that literature onto our hypotheses. And we used to do this with spreadsheets. We used to do this by manually characterizing articles based on themes, methodologies, and findings. We don't have to do that anymore. Litmaps, Research Rabbit, these kinds of tools out there in the market will do all of this for you. So do have a look at this. I hope that you're getting the sense that we are living in an amazing time. We can dramatically speed up the way that we do those tasks that used to take us ages as researchers. We've summarized for you here again the differences in the major AI literature mapping tools. You can take a screenshot of this. Again, you can look at this a little bit later in your own time, but there are a number of key ones. We've put them here for you. If you need access to any of them, again, get in touch with me. Something that we do a lot as well in the kind of editorial office and working with researchers, as we do these training sessions for researchers all over the world, all of the time, helping people to put a draft abstract together. AI can do this for you. It can build you a rough abstract, help you get started, but this is only going to be a template. Your own data, results, and insights will shape the final version. Of course, we can also use AI to help us create pre-submission inquiries, drafting polite and well-structured inquiry emails to the editor, personalizing your draft by inserting your real findings, of course. But these are the kinds of tasks for which you can use your favorite AI tool, a pre-submission inquiry. Tell it to help you to write one. But of course, and I'm sure we'll come back to this a lot later on in our discussion this evening, what are your journal's AI and authorship policies? These differ widely across publishers, different journals, different publishers have different guidelines. There are no standardized guidelines across the publishing industry, unfortunately, at the moment. So you need to be aware of your journal, your target journal. What are you supposed to do? What are they asking you to do in terms of which AI tools you should be describing and putting into perhaps your acknowledgements or into your cover letter? We've talked about putting papers together, thinking about literature, searching the literature. Citations are key as well, because citations give credit. They establish the foundation of your work. But this is one area in the use of AI tools where you really have to be very, very careful, because more and more documented examples of various AI, LLMs, and other kinds of tools coming up with fabricated or careless references. So as a researcher, it's your responsibility to make sure you have read, really actually sourced all of the literature in your article. You can use AI to help you come up with literature to look at, but you do need to actually look at it yourself. Always verify those sources that are cited, that are given to you by IA. It can help you manage those long reference lists, format styles, ensure consistency. Gone, ladies and gentlemen, gone are the days where we have to sit there carefully reformatting a reference list from one article structure, one journal style to another. I used to spend days doing this when I was a PhD student. That's not something that you need to do anymore. You can do it with AI. You can tell your favorite tool to reformat your reference list for this journal or for that journal. But as I've mentioned already, beware of fake references. They often look real, but they're often hallucinated, fabricated. You've got to verify yourself before including them in your manuscript. And a general rule of thumb for all of us as researchers, don't cite a paper that you've never actually read. What we've done here is we've summarized reading and note-taking tools here on a series of slides for you. You can also have a look at these later in your own time. But what we used to do pre-AI and now what we do afterwards, using tools like SciSpace, Copilot, and a range of LLMs to help us build the structure of our paper. And that's key. As Professor Nick was saying, when we put together those 18 paragraphs for our next research paper, we're going to be building the structure of a research paper. But you can do it with AI. You can prompt AI to generate draft section headings. Ask your favorite tool to give you logical sequences, section headings, give outputs that spark ideas, but you've got to then refine them into a narrative that fits your science. And those 18 paragraphs that Professor Nick mentioned in his talk are the narrative that fills your scientific research article and gives it meaning. Drafting your paragraphs, you can use AI to assist with sentence level phrasing. You can use it to assist with word choice. But don't ever use an AI tool to draft entire sections. This leads to errors, vagueness, or loss of your scholarly tone. Famous example doing the rounds at the moment on social media, an Elsevier article written by a number of colleagues over there in China. At the beginning of the introduction, the paper says, "Of course, let me give you a suggestion for an ideal introduction." And they didn't delete it, they just put it straight into the paper and it ended up getting published. And that's not something that should ever happen. That's not something that should get through peer review. You should preserve your scholarly voice. Editors and reviewers expect that authentic voice. AI-generated text, as you'll be well aware, often sounds generic. So revise carefully, maintain your own perspective and your own tone. You're building a career as a researcher. So you're going to build an oeuvre of scholarly work that sounds like you, and you want to maintain that voice in the way that you put your papers together, in the way that you make your figures, in the way that you structure your arguments. And don't forget as well that publishers are up against the game as well. They're using AI similarity checks to assess how much of your voice really is AI generated. But at the end of the day, you should be using these tools to help you speed up the process. Editing your paper, revising the text at the draft stage. AI can be used to flag long sentences, suggest transitions, or identify inconsistencies. It's the advisor, but you remain the decision maker as we edit our work. Simplify complex language. Keep your English simple. One of the really fantastic things about academic English is that it can be, should be, needs to be as simple as possible. Often, in my experience, researchers around the world forget the basic fact that most of the people who are going to be reading your paper when you publish it in RBMO or another fantastic journal, they're not going to be native English speakers. Most people reading papers are not native English speakers. So keep your English simple. Use AI to simplify your language. Don't let it dumb down the language. Maintain that precision. Edit for correctness, catch grammar, punctuation, and style errors. Factual correctness. We've put together a number of tools here for you as well. What did we do pre-AI? What are we doing now post-AI? Don't worry about reading all of these. We'll give you the PDFs at the end of the day. But I would say as well that you could be not just putting your structure, putting your papers together, helping with the literature, searching the literature formatting the literature, putting your research together, also thinking about writing things like cover letters to the editor with AI. You can draft a polite, structured cover letter, personalize it with accurate details, and don't forget to spell the journal editor's name correctly. I've lost count of the number of cover letters I've received at my journal that still have, "We are wishing to submit this paper to Nature," and with the Nature editor's name. The authors have not even bothered to reformat the paper for resubmission to another journal. So, in summary, when using AI and the range of tools that we've summarized in the tables in this presentation, in your next research project, in your next piece of research writing, verify all content, disclose your use of AI, and check your compliance with your journal, with your publisher's policies, because this will help to protect both you, the author, and the publisher. The last thing that you want is a problem in peer review. The last thing that you want is a problem later and your paper may have to get retracted. Let's have a look. The authors used an AI-based language tool to improve the grammar and the readability of the manuscript. That's okay. AI-assisted editing software was used to manage citations and maintain the consistency of reference formatting. That's okay, but AI used in the preparation of the manuscript overall is not okay. Here's my checklist for ethical AI use. I won't read it out for you, but it is important to be aware of the tools that you can use as an author. Be aware of your publisher, your journal's guidelines, and be ethical and open and transparent in what you do. Here's a case study of good practice. AI for grammar and reference formatting, verifying all outputs, disclosing transparently what you did to the journal. You've ended up with a polished, a trustworthy manuscript, as opposed to somebody, I know it's not going to be you, letting AI write their whole draft, accepting all changes blindly and failing to disclose. And therefore your paper contains fabricated references, misleading claims, it gets rejected, or worse, it gets later retracted. So my key takeaways, and thank you so much for the chance to do this. Thank you to Duncan, Dr. Nick, and the team for the chance to be here this evening. AI is a tool, not a co-author. Use it to save time, not to replace your critical thinking, and always, 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 always verify, disclose, and preserve your scholarly voice. Thank you so much for the opportunity to do this, and I welcome questions. I'll be around for the rest of the session. Thanks again, and off to the next speaker we go.
Gareth, fantastic. What a tour de force that was. Beautifully and compellingly presented. Thank you so much. A lot of information there. For those of you who are not familiar with AI, I think I would recommend the recording afterwards because there's a lot of richness in that presentation, which I'm sure you'll all find useful. I mean, very briefly, RBMO is a supporter of AI. It is a great leveler of the playing field. It means we can focus on the science, and people for whom English isn't their first language, that's no longer needs to be a barrier to publishing with us. But do look at the instructions to authors, because we're very clear about what we expect you to tell us about AI and how to use it. But it's very much aligned to everything that Gareth has said. So I'm very grateful also, Gareth, to stick around for the questions. He's speaking to us from India this evening, and it's probably 1 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So thanks, Gareth, for being prepared to stay around. So we're going to move to our next speaker now. Many of you will be very familiar with Duncan. He's been with us as development editor for a number of years now, and he is the person who puts out our insights every month, which has gathered a huge following. And we're very grateful to the work he does together with Simon Brown to summarize the issues that we're covering in our journal in a way which hopefully is engaging for you. And certainly the number of you who are following those would suggest that's the case. Duncan has a 20-year experience in the scholarly journal industry. And alongside his work he does for us, he serves as director of the European Association of Science Editors. So he brings a lot of knowledge and experience to this role. And tonight he's going to share that with us around the process of what happens to papers once you've submitted, the process of peer reviewing. And I've seen some questions coming in asking about this and the period of time it takes to review and all of those things. I think you'll find his talk on this very helpful. Duncan, over to you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Nick. And before I get going, just on the topic of mentioning insights, yeah, that is our journal newsletter. It comes out every month. We post it through our mailing list and through our LinkedIn newsletter. And for anyone that isn't following us on LinkedIn already, we are a hair's breadth away from 10,000 followers on LinkedIn. I wouldn't normally ask, but since we're so close, if anyone wants to help us just tap us over the line of 10,000 followers, that would be greatly appreciated, just because I like a nice round number, and that would be a nice big round number. Okay, so I'm here to speak to you in this session about peer review, how to revise papers, and a little bit on how to deal with rejection, but I don't want to dwell too much on the negatives. So, peer review. It is discussed a lot behind the scenes of the journal publishing world. In fact, this week is peer review week itself, and Gareth is on the organising steering committee of peer review week this year. And it is on the theme of AI in peer review. So we've sort of almost accidentally stumbled upon a relevant peer review week webinar for you. Last week, the Peer Review Congress was held in Chicago, a 4-day congress presenting research into peer review, scientometrics, ethics, and editorial processes. And there are many journals devoted to researching and publishing research on peer review and editorial processes too. And there are many reports from industry vendors and organizations, most recently one last week from Silverchair, owners of ScholarOne, based on data from the thousands of journals managed through their platform. These pages of other reports from previous years from Publons and Editage, big editing companies. Which is to illustrate that there are constant, highly active efforts being made across the world, across the industry, to improve the lives of researchers, authors, editors, reviewers, and journal managers, and understand better about the process and help to develop it and improve it and respond to the developing needs of journal management. So why do we peer review? Particularly if we have people like Professor Macklon giving us such granular, insightful instruction on how to write papers. After we've watched his presentation, we can go away, write a paper. Why do we need anyone else to check it afterwards? It will be immaculate. Well, encouraging experts to review scientific papers is at the heart of what we do at RBMO. Particularly as pressures on the academic community increase. For us at the journal, peer review is a core tenet of science. In many instances, the quality of the paper is transformed during the process, and a high quality review is of huge value to the authors as well as to the journal itself. And peer review serves a much wider purpose than its stereotypically feared gatekeeping function, preventing papers from being published. There are shared goals and values between every party involved, goals of the reviews themselves, goals of the journal, and the value to the reviewers performing them. Some of the shared goals that reviewers may have with a journal are involvement in the discipline, getting more greatly involved and advancing the field, solving problems that help the world or the smaller communities within it, developing underrepresented fields, and ultimately becoming a leading voice in your chosen field. This is what you might want to do as an individual researcher, and this is what journals want to do as a kind of venue of publication of research. The goals of reviewing itself are to enhance the quality of the submitted articles for the benefit of the researcher, making yourself look as good as possible, and for the journal to present top quality research in the best way possible. It can identify errors. Of course, peer review may identify inaccuracies, methodological issues, gaps in reasoning, fine-tune a lot of writing, comment on statistical presentation and methods, and it upholds standards of research fields, checks for accepted methodologies, statistic reporting techniques and processes, and ethical conduct to a degree. Whether peer review can or should detect deliberate, deceptive fraud is a matter of some debate. It's incredibly difficult and it's incredibly time consuming. And there is something of a sense of goodwill and good faith, treating papers that are submitted to a journal in good faith. So I guess we will leave the whole concept of fraud to another session. But the reviewing goal is to uphold the editorial standards of the journal and also foster relationships between reviewers and the authors, the journal editors. It's a community building exercise. And journal editors are looking for useful, constructive feedback to help them make decisions on articles and to provide that feedback to authors to help them improve their papers. Now, a good review is clearly communicated to achieve both of these goals. Clearly structured comments with specific details that are required to address the queries that the reviewers have are valuable. And we want to provide a service to authors, which means timely decisions, which means reviewers that meet deadlines are fantastic contributors to journals. And together, this makes journals, like timely reviews, timely decisions to authors, makes journals a reliable publication for researchers to submit to. So the value of reviewing itself. Why do people review is a very frequently asked question. Well, initially, for younger researchers and your first reviews, reviewing can provide insights into journal perspectives and operations, which can be very helpful for developing your own papers. Seeing other reviewers' comments on the same papers that you commented on as a reviewer can help provide different perspectives into the same research, help you improve your own writing skills and your own papers. Reviewing is also a great way for your name to appear in front of journal editors, your peers, the top minds, the senior figures in the field. And providing these people with helpful critique can raise your own profile in the field. And it can also foster connections between authors and reviewers and the editors, segueing from the previous slide. But indeed, at RBMO, we even have a special viewpoint article based on quality reviews that we receive, where we can invite the reviewer to expand on their comments or on any themes that they brought up if they're particularly interesting into a formal article. So these and the other ideas mentioned can all help advance your career. So as a reviewer, and the review process has far greater function than simply a kind of binary gatekeeping of preventing articles or accepting articles. Now, the review process at RBMO, we have 5 roles involved, which means at least 5 pairs of eyes on papers that make it to review. RBMO is one of the relatively few journals in the scheme of things to have a dedicated managing editor that oversees the running of the journal and supports the peer review process. Not all journals have a single dedicated person. Some journals managers are part of a large list managed from a publisher admin, and while at the other end, some are run entirely by an editor-in-chief with no other support. So we have Caroline Blackwell. Nick mentioned her in his session as well. And she is a name anyone submitting it to us will be familiar with. She is our point of contact for all editorial queries. Caroline and her assistant Emma check papers on submission. As an author, you've got to get past them first as they check for the basic submission requirements. As a reviewer and section editor, you're likely to hear from them a lot. They supervise the peer review process, sending papers to the appropriate section editors, subject editors, reviewers, and respond to all the reviewing and administrative queries, which for a journal the size of RBMO is very much a full-time job. Among our initial checks are some ethical checks aided by automations. Many of you might be familiar with the text similarity scores through platforms like Authenticate, but we also have duplicate submission scores too, where we can see submissions active in other journals that match those sent to RBMO. And this type of technology is becoming more widespread as many in cross-publisher journals, as many more journals are able to collaborate on identifying these types of duplicate submissions. Submitting a paper to multiple journals at the same time can result in a lot of problems and a lot of wasted resources and editorial time, reviewer time, and is considered unethical practice. So please don't do it, but it does happen to the extent that these kind of tools have been developed to identify it. If you do this, all of the journals definitely will reject your paper. But I said I didn't want to dwell too much on anything negative, but that's certainly one of the factors that comes up in peer review and submission a lot. And it's very tempting to do it to save you as an author time, but it will ultimately result in papers being rejected. So if your papers do make it past the initial check, they're passed to the editors-in-chief, Juan and Nick. And here they pass the first aims and scope check, which, as Nick mentioned in his presentation, is it interesting? Is it sound? Will it aid the journal's mission? And of course, I should mention that editors direct the whole vision of the journal too, not just take part in the peer review aspect of it. Next, our editors are assigned papers by the editors-in-chief. They might also reject the paper prior to reviewing if they don't feel it's suitable for the journal too. If they do feel it's suitable, it's passed to the section editors to oversee the peer reviewing. We have 8 different sections of the journal with 3 to 11 at the moment specialized section editors overseeing each of them. So the section editor aims to receive at least 2 reviews per paper before making a recommendation to the editor, who will make the decision on the article and send you the reviews as the author. Now, as you may know, it's becoming increasingly difficult to find reviewers. All journals and researchers are feeling the pressure of increased submissions around the world. And this page from the Scholar One report I mentioned earlier shows that 54% of review requests are declined by reviewers, which is up by over 10% since 2020. So reliable reviewers are great, but editors are aware of not overburdening individuals with too many reviews. So this part of the process is where a lot of the time in reviewing goes, as it becomes increasingly difficult to get those 2 or 3 reviewers. And it's very important to note something that we are always trying to complete the peer review process as quickly as possible. And I often see comments on social media sites, particularly if anyone is a member of Reviewer2 Must Be Stopped on Facebook. Lots of complaining in that group. And people complaining that editors sit on papers. Well, I can say categorically, no editors sit on papers for no reason at all, just for the sake of it. There's always a reason why papers are languishing in peer review. Maybe it's because we can't find the right specialist reviewer, or we just cannot find anyone with enough time to be able to commit to the paper. So we've got some reviews. The editor is able to make a decision. Most journals tend to have the same types of decisions with different names for them, and they can ultimately be grouped into acceptance, heavy, light or heavy revisions, and rejects. Professor Macklon has been talking about how to catch the editor's attention with a paper, but that paper must also be sound and of value to the journal. And if not, it will receive an immediate reject. And the main reasons for papers to be rejected at this stage are lacking subject relevance to the journal, lacking novelty, or showing some critical ethical or methodological issues. Immediate rejects account for 63% of all decisions at the journal, which means nearly 40% of articles make it to reviewing stages in some form. 83% of all the rejected papers from the journal are made prior to review. And this means that our editors are very good at spotting the papers that won't make it through the review process, which saves you, the authors, a lot of time, because these decisions are made quickly. If your paper is not suitable, you'll hear from us back within a week, in a matter of days, and you can move on to finding a more suitable journal for your article. Rejection after review is given to those papers where deeper scrutiny by experts, even more specialized in the most up-to-date fine details of the topics, reveal some limitations or fatal flaws that make it undesirable to proceed with. These can be compromised methodology, unsupported conclusions. As Nick was saying in his article, don't kind of over-glamorize your results if the data doesn't back it up. When the editor and reviewer get to that point and they find that it doesn't, the conclusions are unsupported by the data, that's likely to result in a reject. And if the paper provides only a minimal value to the field, because we do only have so much space in the journal and so much time to manage and edit all of these papers, as you'll hear from Fiona very shortly about the amount of work that goes into them there. Rejections after review account for just 13% of all papers. So at RBMO, if you do make it past the hurdle of immediate reject and triage, there is a reasonable chance, well, there is a definite chance that the editors are interested in your paper, and only some critical things will prevent it from getting through. A reject and resubmit is more promising, but still indicates the paper has some serious issues. Things like perhaps too small a sample population, or unclear methodology, or inappropriate statistical methods, where clarification could make or break a paper. Revise for further consideration and accept with revision. Two decisions that are similar and relate to the depth or scientific integrity of the revisions required. Most revisions here relate to clarifications or enhancing the qualities of what is already presented, and both are very positive. 50% of papers that go on to receive one of these revision decisions get accepted. So it's incredibly likely, if you're asked to revise, that your paper will be accepted, provided you make the appropriate revisions. And the last editorial decision is, of course, accept. Usually after just one revision, though occasionally they may take more, and within an average of 100 days from submission to decision, including the revision time, which is pretty quick. Our acceptance rate is 22% of submissions. Take that as you wish. It is very competitive, but we don't necessarily aim to reject papers out of hand. This is not quite the final stage of the processing of the paper, as Nick said. From here, we'll pass you to our science editors, and Fiona will be along shortly to give you insights into what happens after you receive an accept decision. But should you receive any other decisions, I have the final section of my talk in how to deal with the different decisions you receive. So as an author, receiving critical feedback can be frustrating, upsetting, intimidating. That is the scary part of the peer review process. Even seasoned authors can get put out by reviewer comments. So firstly, it's a good idea to read the letter, put it aside, cool down, and then come back to it later with a little bit of clearer head, cooler perspective. Maybe some of the things that seemed unreasonable and excessive may not seem quite so when you come back to it. Good idea to note the journal's resubmission deadline as well, so you can prepare yourself in time to resubmit by the deadline. So I'm going to go for a quick little 6-point process of responding to reviews. First, an overlooked tip. Given the increasing difficulty of finding reviewers and the time pressures on reviewers, it's a nice touch to thank the editor and reviewers for their decision and their efforts, acknowledge receipt of the decision and confirm whether you will revise or not. Then, after having gone through the emotional roller coaster of reading your review reports, give yourself and your team a little time and space to calm down before responding to all of the suggestions raised in the decision letter. Keep the standard of dialogue high. Make sure you address all the reviewer suggestions in the same way as you would like to be responded to if you made some suggestions to someone. In practice, this means addressing and clearly answering every single point of the reviews. By doing so, you take every chance to make your publication stronger, even if there are not changes, or even if there are changes you won't include in this paper, you can still kind of respect the reviewer's time and comments by acknowledging them and justifying why you haven't included that change in the paper. Listing all the comments of each reviewer separately and assigning actions to them, for example, comment 1, action 1, will show that you took the reviewer's advice seriously and explain how you implemented the changes to make the reviewers and the editor's life much easier when they receive your revision. I mean, there could be a matter of weeks or months between your first submission and the decision and you submitting your revision. And you can't really necessarily expect the editor and the reviewers to remember everything that they said or about your paper. So to make their lives as easy as possible, to be able to give you as positive a decision as possible and view your paper in as favorable a light as possible, make all your responses as clear as possible, to the point, explain how you made all the changes and what you did instead of just saying accepted or corrected. And responding to reviews often includes elements of disagreement and negotiation between authors and reviewers. And you don't necessarily need to accept and execute all the changes in the review report, but what is important is to not ignore any comments, but instead respectfully but clearly explain why those requests, why you feel they fall outside of the scope of your paper. And remember, as Professor Macklon was saying, the paper should be very focused, like laser focused on the question. So if you do feel what an author has requested, a reviewer has requested, takes it outside the focus of the paper and will add too much extra to it, then justify that, and hopefully the editor and reviewers will agree. And finally, the reviewers of the paper will likely be one of the first readers of your article outside of your immediate sphere of colleagues, and their comments are likely to be similar to those of the eventual readers of your work. So this is an excellent chance to get feedback from how your paper will be received out in the world from different expertises or backgrounds. And it provides a really good opportunity to clarify and strengthen your paper for a broad readership. In many cases, a request for clarification by a reviewer is a chance to make your work more accessible and give you the chance to reach potential readers, potential collaborators outside of your team, or immediate discipline or country, or even profession. Finally, if you receive a rejection, don't be disheartened. As you've seen, most papers are rejected from high impact journals, and some before any judgment of real quality of the paper is made. They're just not a right fit for the journal. So don't be too disheartened. Move on to your second choice journal. In a previous webinar, we spoke about journal selection and submission, mentioning how to create a list of journals that your work will be relevant to. So in the context of the decision received, consider which journal would be most important. Do consider revising from the comments you received in relation to those. And there's a chance, because there's a chance the second journal could send your paper to the same reviewers and no reviewer likes to receive an identical paper if they've already taken the time to provide a few pages of critique for you to incorporate. And very importantly, most importantly, as Gareth said, and I'll repeat it for emphasis because it is both disappointing and amusing. Addressing a different journal, a different editor reveals they are not your first choice as an author, and it's not the best foot to start on, though it doesn't necessarily or ever really affect the review process. It's just not an ideal way to introduce your work to the journal. Once you've changed the journal, then you're free to submit with good luck from me in your authoring journey. And thanks for listening to this part of our RBMO Live webinar.
Thank you very much, Duncan. A lot of very useful information, I think, insights for what happens behind the scenes with papers and the importance indeed of peer reviewing. We'll be coming on to questions later, but I've already seen one or two coming in asking about, the becoming a peer reviewer, and please let us know if you're interested. Just write to the journal. We're always looking for people who are willing to do this, and it is, I would say, a privilege. And those of us who are wanting to see papers published, I do feel we have an obligation to help the process. So I think if you are somebody who's publishing work, looking to have published work, it's very important to contribute to that peer reviewing process. It's also a great way of learning how to improve your papers, without doubt. So thank you very much, Duncan. That's very comprehensive, and we'll hopefully have some time to address any other questions that come up. So we're going to go to our final speaker now, and that is Fiona Warrander. Now, Fiona Warrander has been a science editor for us at RBMO for a few years now, joining Catherine Field, who's been leading that group. Many of you will know her name and the names of the scientific editors. They are an element of the journal we're particularly proud of, I have to say. It is sometimes difficult, I do understand, when you've had a paper accepted and you think you can step back from it to be asked to re-engage with the process of scientific editing, but it is very important. It is a process by which you can improve the paper that's going to be out there forever. So do take advantage of it, do respond in a timely and full way to the suggestions and requests being made. Fiona, who's got a background as an embryologist, understands our field from the inside out. She knows about it. She has a PhD, of course, and has worked in a number of different scientific roles, and we're delighted to have her as a key member of the scientific editing team. So Fiona, over to you, and please tell us what goes on at that stage of the paper prior to final publishing.
Certainly. So hi everyone. As Nick said, thank you for the introduction. So I'm Fiona, I'm one of our science editors, and yes, my background is rather varied between humans and other organisms for reproduction as well. So one of my job is to help make good papers better, as we say. So once it's got to me, we know it's a good paper and we want it to shine, basically. So how does RBMO do this? So where other journals might simply have asked for their final step of revisions and then it's accepted and it's off it goes, we have a final editing stage. So this involves checking and corresponding with authors to give directed final revisions. So Nick mentioned in his talk about writing a paper, take the hand of your reader to go through your work. Well, we're here to help hold your hand while you hold the reader's hand. So we check every single paper that comes through, that gets published. It's a very, very involved check of the details of the paper. So it involves discussions. It's a collaborative effort with the authors. So we will send comments, suggestions, requirements for changes, and it can take as little as a day for you to change them, or longer. Sometimes there are more involved changes, and typically I would say as well, the experimental papers, because they contain so much more, tend to have so much more come back as well. But what we want to do is make sure results are given the spotlight that they deserve. So we think everyone knows when they've written a paper, they've pored over it for a long time, your co-authors have looked at it, it's been to reviewers, it's been back, it's been changed. Everyone can be too close sometimes, and you can't see the little tweaks that have popped up and changed as it goes along. And we know not everyone, authors and peer reviewers, have the time to do the fine detail check. So what exactly sort of do we do in this? So as I said, it's the fine tuning, but the simple task is the story the work tells being backed up by the data? Has every method been noted in the paper? Is this consistent? Is a dosage noted in the methods the same dosage they've used in results? Nick mentioned before about statistical testing. Is it the correct one to have made that conclusion? Most commonly, have they used multiple t-tests, but it should have been an ANOVA? Are they overreaching? Are there repeat patients in a clinical data set? Do they need to use clustering analysis? Sometimes we're looking at it from a science communication readability angle, as Duncan said, reaching a broad audience. The reviewers we pick are specialised for the topic. You are specialised for the topic. It might be that there's something you think is so glaringly obvious that you've not said it, but it's not obvious to necessarily some people who might want to get the content from your paper. Again, we don't want to change the flow and the voice of the work, like Gareth was talking about, your own scholarly voice. We want to preserve that. It's just a case of sort of precision. Again, sometimes there might be a key result that's got a little bit lost in revisions, just want to highlight it more, again, maybe in the abstract or the text. As I said before, adding a simple statement of something that you think is obvious and you just haven't said it can just go in, and it just adds a little bit more impact that you don't realise. And catching errors is a huge part of it. So it happens a lot more than anyone would want to think it does. And anyone who's ever emailed us back saying, oh, thank you so much for catching that. You are not the first, you are not going to be the last. And, we know a paper goes through a lot of changes until the final acceptance. Sometimes it's as simple as missing that a result that changed has been referenced somewhere else as well. The direction of the analysis changed, a different statistical test, or taking a bit of data out that was inappropriate has changed the significance, and just good old-fashioned typos that maybe a copy editor wouldn't pick up, particularly in things like the numbers and tables that I'll highlight a little bit after. So why are we doing this? Again, it was important to Bob Edwards that it was set up like this to help the authors, but the main thing is as well, we want to maintain research integrity. So again, this is the kind of thing that everyone should be looking at when they're doing the peer review process, but we know that it is a lot of time for people. And sometimes they can't pick up everything. Sometimes they're a specialist in one part and not another. So again, it's things, transparency. Could someone else repeat the work? Like Nick said, make sure the methods are robust. Just make sure that we are holding everything that we can for integrity. As I said before, we're there to help hold your hand and guide you through this bit. Once it gets to us, we don't want to be finding any problems with it. And typically we shouldn't be, but again, we are that fine-tooth comb of, has enough rigor been applied to this? Are they seeing what they say they are? So one of the things as well is about applying the RBMO style. So does the paper fit the guide for authors? We're not there to fix all of it. We do want you to read it before you submit to us, or at least if it's going through revisions and it's looking good, please make sure you've read it and that you've done things. We do affect things like uniformity, so our chart styles, legends, that you get all the information you need from them, that they're objective and they're not descriptive. Standardization, we want RBMO to be, a leading journal, and again, down to the integrity, things like antibody RRIDs, omics data that's in repositories, all these things that hopefully can help readers check that, there is proper integrity behind the work that we're publishing. Data analysis, we have a statistical advisor, David Macklon, that we can reach out to, check things are okay if we're not sure of things. And p-values is a long-standing discussion, obviously, across science. Do they add weight? Basically, we just have a standpoint as a journal, and ours is that, yes, they do have a use. So within results, if it can be tested, we only say it's higher, lower, more, whichever direction it is, if the test is significant. But we also want individual p-values shown for everything that has been tested, so the readers can interpret the data themselves. Something we can announce, this was significant, this difference was, but one's 0.048, one's 0.051. They're so close, and it can be an author that overstates this. So this is why we want the reader to be able to interpret everything themselves. So a couple of examples. I should say none of this is real data. I've certainly not wanted to risk anyone thinking, oh my gosh, that's my work. But also, given the absurdity of some of it, I'm certainly not going to be hired by a paper mill anytime soon. So we have here on the left figure 1, and we've got, well, we don't know what we've got really, have we? They've left out the labels. So then we can see we've added here, it's positive pregnancy, it's percentages. We've actually got the groups now. Within the legend, you can see that we've defined what the positive pregnancy is, because that, again, is such a variable term. We do ask you to add these definitions and things if they've not, because what a positive pregnancy is to one clinic can be totally different to another. Again, we've got what each of the groups is, drug dosages, what we're showing in the data, so we know it's now a standard deviation there, what the tests have been done with, and it just is a lot neater, become a lot more uniform, and what we want to make sure is that standalone interpretation is possible. And another handy thing of this is it gives you a figure that you can use in presentations when you're talking about your work in talks in the future. Say, we've already worked on this, and you have a figure that you don't need to mess around with anymore. It's got everything you should need on it. Small bit on errors, just as a table here. So again, we can see this is the wrong percentage. So if there's a table with numbers and you've given us n numbers and percentages, you can guarantee that as the science editors, we will check every single one of those, which can take a huge amount of time for us. And it's almost satisfying when we find an error, because, you know, it has been worth it. But this is just a slight typo here. This one, 7 out of 80, and it's 10%. Is there some missing data? Have they miscalculated it? This is clarifying, we need a little bit more data on that. Missing units, what are we presented with? Is it a range? Is it the IQR? This can be big when you're looking at data. Again, I mentioned the variable terms. 20% live birth, great, but is that transfers, cycles, positive pregnancies? At what point, what's included? Things like corrections, so saying there it's not statistically different, but we have a p-value of 0.049, and they've stated their significance level is 0.05. So yes, it needs to be. This might, again, have just come from one of the revisions at some point in the paper. And again, just at the bottom here, things like saying, this is just an example of a meta-analysis, but it all rings true for everything. Checking low to medium risk of bias, but that's not correct. We've got one here that doesn't match, and again, claiming the result here and it not matching there. So it's just, again, cross-checking everything. If you've got a table that says something and another table with the same numbers, we check that you've got 20 patients in that table, and if you haven't, why haven't you? And all things like that, and just making sure it ties in and it backs itself up, basically. But we also need to say thank you to the authors for bearing with us, because as Nick said, we know it can feel a bit tedious when you think you're done and this email suddenly pops in saying, can you make these changes, please? So we know it feels a bit tedious, but we think it's a very valuable check, and we get many notes of positive feedback from our authors. So what we're working to is to present you guys having to, at worst, retract a paper or publish errata if there's a glaring error in there that just everyone has missed to that point. But this here is just a nice word cloud based on some of the responses we get from authors. This is just from the last 6 months, and every comment that I've put onto this has been more than one comment from someone in response to our work on their manuscripts. So there are a lot of authors that do come back and publish again with us, and do value the input. And it is a nice thing to see when a paper gets out there that we've helped shape, and when we get some thanks for it as well, is always appreciated. Okay.
Fiona, thank you so much for that really beautiful overview and explanation to our audience tonight about the crucial role that you and your colleagues in the science editing group play. It is a lot of work, a lot of concentration, the sort of thing that could easily be missed. And what it means for our authors is that when the paper does emerge, the chance of them needing to publish an erratum or correct something in public, which is something none of us like to do, is very low because they've been subject to this degree of scrutiny. So it is a very crucial part of the journal of who we are. It does mean our processes are slightly different, but we believe that it's very, very worthwhile because it means that the paper that you publish with RBMO is something that we know you're going to be proud of in the long term. So thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you again to all our speakers for staying the course tonight, because we do have some time to address some of the very many questions that came in. Thank you all for sending them to us. I've got a little screen here with some questions on. We're not going to be able to address them all because some people have got to go to bed tonight, especially Gareth, where it's 2 o'clock in the morning now. But they've been really interesting. I think what I can say is that some of the earlier questions that came in have been addressed, I would say, by our other speakers. So I'm going to focus on questions which I feel address points which perhaps we haven't raised, and which may be of interest to you all. So starting with my talk, most of the questions that came in were to do with the process, which I think have been very carefully covered by our other speakers. There's one that caught my eye around about conflict of interest. Somebody's asked, what about conflict of interest statements? And if I write about my company's results, how can I be not penalized for using our data? So let me be very clear about this. A lot of excellent research comes from companies who are innovating and are doing excellent science and wanting to publish it. And we've got no issue with that at all. The point about conflicts of interest is that it is just about being transparent. So we don't mind you having conflicts of interest, but we want you to state them. So anyone reading the paper can make their own assessment of to what extent your background or your context from which you wrote the paper might have affected the outcome. And what I would encourage you to do is to overstate your conflict of interest rather than understate it. And as it happens, about 3 or 4 years ago, perhaps longer, the previous chief editor of RBMO and myself wrote an editorial on this very topic, and those of you who are interested could maybe go to it. But the bottom line is just state them, state the conflicts of interest. There would be very few that would be find so severe that it would stop publication in the journal. I'm not saying there are none, there will be some. But what is sometimes can be a reason to retract a paper is when we later discover that there was a conflict of interest which wasn't declared. And if it had been declared at the time, we would have probably been able to still accept the paper. So please over-report your conflict of interest rather than under-reporting, and don't be afraid that they are going to stop the process of publishing. For instance, if you're working for a company, we just need to know, that's it. So I'm going to move on to ask my colleagues some of the questions that came through, and there's quite a lot of questions for Gareth, as we might expect. Here's an interesting one, Gareth. I mean, you presented, there isn't a bewildering array really now, aren't there, of AI tools? I mean, when Juan and I wrote our editorial on AI about not so long ago, it was just ChatGPT, but it's just become an incredible field of options. And one of the questions is, is there one, what is the best AI tool that you would not do without?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, I use DeepSeek. I don't know if you've tried that one, the Chinese yes. Kind of similar to ChatGPT, kind of LLM based module. But yeah, I use it all the time, like for tasks ranging from writing social media posts or helping me put together like social media posts to structuring articles, I would say, like finding references, like coming up with information. I mean, it really is fantastic. So I'm not getting paid by the Chinese government to say this, but you should check it out if you haven't tried DeepSeek before.
Thank you. I think that's a good tip. another question, this one's from Dr. Halia Yusuf, is a question I think you did touch on, but perhaps you could give more on that view. How might AI reshape the future of reference management? You did talk about this, about how AI is, I'm from the generation that used Reference Manager, which
Me too, yeah.
is probably more hard work than it was worth, but anyway, that's for another day. So how might AI reshape the future of reference management, moving beyond automation to providing deeper insights for researchers?
Well, yeah, this is a great question too. And if you haven't tried tools like Litmaps, there's another one called Research Rabbit, which I believe is now acquired by Litmaps, but that's a great place to start because you can, not just like understand what's been recently published and give yourself a very quick overview of what's known like in a particular field. And this used to take days, weeks, like for us to do, like with even with tools like EndNote, Mendeley, and so on, like you'd have to really go back yourself, like through the literature. But now almost instantaneously using a tool like Litmaps, you can give yourself a picture of like what is currently known, the state of the art in a particular field, as well as the connections between what you're looking at in your field and other perhaps seemingly unrelated disciplines. And I think that's the real like big advantage of these tools to answer the question how we will change our view of reference management. Like it's becoming much easier to make connections between supposedly or apparently unrelated fields. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's a simulation engineer working on blood flow in the body and blood flow related to stroking, like in health. And actually, the models that are most applicable to this are from chocolate manufacturing, chocolatiers and people who work on flow in chocolate. And the connections between, the venous system and work that's been done and written about like the flow of chocolate may not have ever, happened if some of these tools had not been applied to some of these questions. So it's a very, 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 very interesting time. Can I quickly also
terrible accident in a
with Willy Wonka's chocolate factory? Yeah. Our friend from Uzbekistan, like I forget your name, Dr. Shomaruvov. Like I have a friend that actually the IT community in Uzbekistan is very strong, one of the strongest groups in the world. There's a very strong IT community in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent. You should connect with them and get access to some of the forefront developments in AI tools like in your region.
Thank you. I have another question for you, Gareth, before I let you off the hook. And that is from Apan Chatterjee. Just to ask your view on using AI to help in statistical analysis for authors. What do you think about that?
Well, this has been done by journals for years, like checking the statistical analyses that they see in papers. There's been a number of tools that publishers have used for, almost a decade now to check the accuracy of statistical analyses that are seen in research papers as part of the pre-peer review and or peer review process. Because as you know, like it's often very difficult to get access to reviewers who might have the appropriate statistical expertise to evaluate a piece of analysis in a paper. Using tools for doing statistical analyses, I mean, it's about the data, right? I mean, I don't see a big difference like in using a calculator or using a word processor. Like, should I have to declare that? Like if I wrote my PhD thesis on a typewriter and then, I used a word processor, should I have to declare that use of a tool, that's different from, earlier technologies? Like, I think we should look at view the use of AI tools no differently to the way that we view the use of any other tool. The problem is when you start to use these approaches to actually generate data, that's the problem. So it's a long-winded answer. Analyzing data, no problem in my view, but collecting data, that's a huge problem.
It is a huge problem, and you flagged it up. One of the first papers we published in RBMO on AI a few years ago was by one of our editors, Senior Altmaier, who many of you will know. And she basically used AI to write a paper. And she would ask ChatGPT, please come up with some data that would show this, or come up with an idea. And she submitted a paper that had been completely written and completely fabricated by AI. Fortunately, she was upfront that that was indeed the purpose of it, but it was quite a salutary read. Also, it made it very clear, as you also alluded to, that there are very evident clues when people have misused AI, and I think, as Duncan has alluded to, the journals and the publishers are upping their game in terms of AI to detect AI. So I think it's important that people realize it's not worth even thinking about going down that route. But your very positive spin on AI, which I completely agree with, shows the incredible value it can be to enhance publishing and enhance the science that we all depend on. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to let you get to bed, Gareth.
Nice. That's very
Thank you
kind
so
of you.
much for staying up. It's really been a great pleasure to have you here, and we really appreciate your talk and your insights. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Great to see everybody. Have a good rest of the evening. Take it easy.
Thanks, Gareth. So we're going to move on now to questions that were posed for Duncan's talk. Quite a range of questions, as you can imagine, because it was a fairly broad topic. One question I've sort of flagged up, somebody has asked, if I publish a poster, if I publish my work as a poster, can I then write a paper, or has it been spent? Duncan, what would you say to that one?
I feel either of us could probably take that question, but in a conference poster or a poster is a different presentation of the data, of the research that you've conducted, and almost all journals would be quite happy to receive the article version, the formal article version of a poster. That's quite often the way of poster presentations at conferences anyway. But again, as with some of the other things we've spoken about today, declaration of it is the essential part. When you submit, it's important to say in the cover letter and as the footnote that some of the materials are previously presented as a poster at this event, but no, it's certainly not spent. No.
No, as Duncan says, we have a cross-check software that will pick up that posters have been published, and it will appear to the editor that there is a very high rate of this data already being out there, but it becomes immediately evident through the software that if it has been a poster at a presentation. So there's no way it doesn't mean that it's spent.
Yeah, and the same with preprints as well. We haven't mentioned preprints at all somehow, but the same with those as well.
Preprints is an interesting one for us as editors of a journal, because we completely understand why people want to make a claim to an area, and I think that's what drives it. They want to make sure that the world knows that these people that they've done this work. It does get flagged up by our systems if it has been a preprint. To date, we've taken the view that we accept that this is part of the scientific process now. But clearly, if it's already been in a peer-reviewed journal, that's a different matter. And I think that brings me to a topic I would like also to ask Duncan about, and that is duplicate submission. This is a problem and something which is fair to say we're pretty strict about, isn't it, Duncan?
Yeah, yes. I mean, quite rightly so. I think primarily the reason is because a published journal article is considered the version of record. When someone cites that article, everyone is supposed to be able to find that one article, and it's the same for everyone. So if you submit the same article to two different journals and it somehow ends up being accepted at two different journals, you'll have the same information in two different forms. And as an author, you might have received two different sets of reviews that could have asked two completely different things, and you could have changed the same paper in two different ways. So when someone cites, say, Macklon 2025, but there's two of those and it's the same paper, that's one of the primary reasons for not doing it. And the other one is we're already already strapped for time for reviewers and editors. There's not enough time and review kind of bandwidth to go round. So duplicating that to review the same papers at different journals is a waste of the kind of global resource and goodwill of the academic community. And it's also your field as well, the same field. They're your peers, they're, you know, future collaborators. It could be anyone. So, you know, you don't want to risk wasting those people's times. So yeah, in general, the publishing industry takes a very dim view of duplicate submissions,
and it's becoming very good at detecting it. And you know, it's something that I know that we at RBMO get flagged up on occasion, sadly. It's also worth saying that sometimes it may be that duplicate submission gets flagged up because there's been a very short time between rejection from one journal and submission to another one. So if you do get a query from us about duplicate submission, it may be that you've got a good explanation for it, but do please respond.
That's true. It's probably worth mentioning. Oh yeah.
I want to jump in and just say, so there's things like as well with duplicates, if they are both published, like you said, Duncan, and they've gone in slightly different directions, they can appear different, and it just can artificially inflate results. So it might be something that's a bit controversial or not very proven, but then someone's doing a meta-analysis down the line and thinks, look, there's these two separate populations, and they've you know, each done this work and each got this result, therefore this technique, this drug, this whatever the intervention was, is really worth doing. But actually it's been artificially inflated because it's the same group. So that's one thing for people to make
a similar
aware of
issue
when they're publishing, but also when they're publishing different data on the same subset of patients as well. We've seen that before sometimes when people will be, they've used a set of patients and then they're looking at the same set of patients for a different matter or something. So we always want people to declare if the population they've used is in another paper, or if the ethics cover a study that they're also citing and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of referred to as salami slicing, just little bits of
yeah. Well, some of them are salami, some are, I've had some papers that are validly different, but similar subsets of people before, and it's just important to obviously have the authors declare this is somewhere else, or the ethical IRB approval did cover like both the studies as well. It's things like that and also if they've stated it, then it prevents one looking at it and knowing if it is or isn't a duplicate, because sometimes they can look very similar, but they are completely separate as well. So it's really important.
Right. Moving on with another question, which I'll perhaps take myself. Somebody has asked whether, you know, there are journals that accept non-hypothesis driven research, just purely descriptive. And of course there are. I mean, not every research question is going to be hypothesis driven, but in general, we prefer it to be. And the reason I say that is that with increasing access to large data sets, what we do sometimes see are papers coming in looking at correlations between two clinical characteristics. And this is something that's quite easy to do when you've got a very large data set. You say, well, why don't we compare that and see if that relates with that? We see that quite a lot. And our editors are instructed to be quite critical of that. Unless there is a rationale stated to justify the analysis, we will often reject these papers right at the very early stage. So if you are doing that kind of research, you need to convince the editors that the research question is justified. It's meeting a gap in the literature, which is an important one. Does it matter? This is really important. We'll sometimes see these huge analysis of data sets for a question that, you know, no one's really asked before because it doesn't really matter. So do remember that and make sure that if you're doing that kind of correlation, that you provide a very convincing hypothesis to that. But there will be other settings where it'll be a descriptive type paper, and that can have a role. I'm going to move towards perhaps the last question now, because it's getting late. It's for you, Fiona. You showed us some tables and some graphs and some examples of what can go wrong. Somebody has asked, what is the most common type of error that you need to spend time on. And I think that'd be really useful because, you know, if people can avoid making them, they can get their paper through to final publication quicker.
A lot of the errors, when it comes to errors, it is a lot of it is where things are mentioned more than once in the text. So if there's a result and then they're referring to it again later, you know, in revision, something's happened, data's come in, it's been reanalyzed, it's changed. They've not then updated it in another place. So they're saying a result at a later point that isn't the result they've had. That's a big one, like, because you're suddenly like, where's this number come from, or whatever it is. But a lot of them as well are in, the more complicated the paper, the more likely there is to be errors as well, I've found. So there are papers that are you really need to be in the head zone to get into, that sometimes have sort of 5-6 tables that all cross-reference each other in a way, and you have, and in quite complicated ways, and you're just adding up the numbers, and it's like this many patients underwent this, and then another table where there's that and the patients that had a positive, and then you look on the last one that's looking at the neonatal outcomes of the positive pregnancies, and you suddenly realize there's more pregnancies in group A than were declared previously, and it's supposedly all the same patient data set going through, and you think, where's this one come from? And you have to go back and say, where was the error? Where have you misclassified someone? And it's just simple things like that sometimes, that it's the real scrutiny of the data that it just, sometimes if a column's been mixed up, or it's just a typo at one point and it gets carried forward without cross-checking back to think, is this the right number of participants or whatever it is at a certain point. So
please, people, do put the effort in as much as you can, because it will be spotted, and we all make errors. But if we can put that effort in to try and to minimize that, it's very, very appreciated.
And I'm here to be a friendly face with it as well.
Exactly. I mean, making good papers better is what it's all about.
It's a secret between you and me.
Very good. Thank you, Fiona. I think we're going to draw the evening to a close now. I want to start by thanking you, Fiona, Duncan, and Gareth for your fantastic contributions this evening. I hope everyone joining us from home has found it interesting and useful, and hopefully inspiring. We look forward to receiving your wonderfully constructed and carefully checked papers at RBMO in the future. We'd be delighted to do so. So thank you to the speakers. I also want to thank the platform, the team from I3, the organizing committee of this initiative, of course, Giles, and Jacques Cohen, Peter Nagy, Marianne Sivates, Thomas Elliott, who's been helping us to make sure that the technology works this evening, Fran Fairley, Violetta Sura, and of course, as I mentioned, Giles Palmer. Thank you all for making this all work for us and allowing us to reach out to colleagues around the world on this very important topic. Our next RBMO webinar will be in December, but there will be another I3 webinar coming up on the 30th of September, I'm told, and it's going to be on the topic of cryogovernance, which is a very current and relevant topic. So thank you, all of you who've joined us from around the world at probably some ungodly hours, or at work, or early in the morning. It's been a pleasure to be able to communicate with you, and thank you for your engaging with the questions. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.